Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I will be taking a look at the Winawer variation of the French defense. This video will be introductory in nature. So the French defense is when we have the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the Winawer variation starts after white plays knight to c3. So this is known, this line, knight to c3, this move, it has many different names. It's known as the Paulson variation. It's also known as the normal variation or just the French main line. And so it has many names, and it is a very important move to study, very important move to have a response to because it is very commonly played at all levels. Beginners play it, intermediate players play it, grandmasters play it. In fact, grandmasters play it all the time. Like, grandmasters generally either are playing knight to c3 or knight d2 these days. And this move, it does many things. Not only does it develop the knight to a good square, but it also defends the e4 pawn, should black try to take it, and it also puts some pressure on the d5 pawn over here. So it basically keeps a lot of the tension in the center. White doesn't clarify the situation in the center just yet, and just keeps things very tense. And so in this position, there are two main choices for black, and a third alternative. So the two main choices are the Winawer variation, that's bishop to b4, and that's what we will look at today. And knight to f6, this is known as the classical variation. That's also a very decent choice. Like, it's a good choice for players who are scared of the Winawer because the Winawer is very theoretical. In fact, I will probably need to make more videos than usual about the Winawer because there is a lot to study, there is a lot to talk about. So the classical variation with knight to f6, that's a good alternative, and I do plan to cover that in a different week, not this week. And another alternative, which isn't as good objectively as the Winawer or the classical, is the Rubinstein variation, which is when black plays d takes e4. And the Rubinstein variation is a decent choice if you are learning the French and you don't want to have to learn too much theory, since you can play it both against the knight c3 line and also against the Tarrasch variation, because in both cases white will respond to d takes e4 with knight takes e4, and it doesn't really matter which square the knight came from. So in this game, we'll be looking at the Winawer variation. So the Winawer variation is very sharp and very complicated. There are quite a few different moves that white can now play here. Quite a few. I will probably look at some of them, since the most popular move by far is pawn to e5. Pawn to e5 is 10 times more popular than the move in second. And the move in second is e takes d5, and then knight to e2 would be a close third. And then after that we have like a3, bishop d3, queen d3. You know, it starts to drop off a fair amount. Engine actually likes the idea of playing queen to f3 even, or even I think queen g4 has been played a few times as well. So there is a lot to study. There are a lot of possibilities, but since this is an introductory video, we'll be looking at the most commonly played move, the one that you're going to see all the time, which is pawn to e5. Before continuing, I thought I should just say a bit more about the ideas of what bishop to b4 is doing. Basically, black is very boldly getting ready to trade their good bishop, the dark squared bishop, the one bishop they have that can actually, do stuff, for white's knight on c3, But hopefully black will be able to do this trade in such a way that black will damage white's pawn structure on the queen side. Alright, so at least black will have that going for them. And this will often lead to quite a few imbalances in the position. Like the Winawer, it is kind of like the Sicilian in a way, in that it's kind of a fighting variation. Like it's a good choice if you want to play for a win, because the games can often get very complicated and it can often come down to which player is more skilled, which player is able to understand the position better. So, the next move that is most commonly played by far, like I think a good number of players with the white pieces might even pre-move this move, since it's also commonly played against the classical variation, and it's not a bad pre-move against the Rubinstein because it's impossible against the Rubinstein because the pawn is taken. The next move by whites is pawn to e5, and this is known as the Winawer advance variation, and that's kind of a funny name because we just looked at quite a few sidelines which, involved quite a few themes involving the advanced variation. But in the case of the Winawer, it's like the advanced variation, but with everything taken to the extreme. Like generally in the advanced variation, what happens is black plays on the queen side and white plays on the king side. White tries to cramp black on the king side and go for an attack over there, while black, strikes at the center, strikes at the pawn on d4, and also, develops on the queen side. Alright, so it's like that, but taken to the extreme. So, if you remember the advanced variation, what is the move that black will generally play here? What is the move that black generally plays in the advanced variation? You in the audience right now, what's the move? Knight to e7? Whose videos were you watching? No, the move is c5. Like, there are other choices for black. There are quite a few choices for black, like b6 looks pretty cool, and knight to e7 is actually a decent choice as well, but I kind of like c5, which is the main move. This is the main line, and things will often get very complicated. Like, black strikes at the center, striking at this pawn, and it looks kind of like an advanced variation, except somehow this bishop teleported over the pawn, and we have a knight on c3. So then here, in this position, there are still a number of choices that white could play. Like, white could play bishop to d2, white could go queen to g4 right away, white could take the pawn on c5, quite a few choices. But since this is an introductory video, we're going to look at the main move, which is pawn to a3, which questions black's bishop, basically asks black, what are you really doing with that bishop? Like, what is the purpose of this thing? Why is this bishop on b4? Or what are you doing with it? And black could play bishop to a5, taking the bishop off of this diagonal and undefending the pawn on c5. Like, that's a reasonable move. Black can play that. That has been played before. But the main move, and one which I think is just a lot of fun, leads to a lot of imbalances in the position, is just bishop takes knight, check. This answers the question posed by pawn to a3. The answer to the question is the point of the bishop was to damage white's pawn structure. And now in this position, there are quite a few imbalances here. The queenside pawns for white, they don't look too good. This structure has been damaged a fair bit. We have an isolated a pawn, and we have doubled backward c pawns. But white does have the bishop pair, and black's bishop is very bad. This bishop is a problem piece for black, as is common in the French defense. And this pawn on e5 is taking away the f6 square from black's knight. Right, so, black has some problems of their own. Black has problems with this knight and with this bishop. So, in this position, there are a number of choices for black, but the most popular choice, and a choice which I do quite like, is just to play knight to e7. the idea of knight to e7 is that black doesn't yet quite know enough information about white's setup, so black's going to react to what white's going to do, accordingly, like based off of what white's next move is going to be. And what black does know is that the knight does not really have a whole lot of squares to go to. It can't go to f6 because it will be taken by the pawn. If it goes to h6, white's bishop will just take it over there, and it will be black who will be having a bad pawn structure now as well. And black might be interested in castling kingside. Like, sometimes black does castle kingside in this line. And sometimes. So overall, knight to e7 is just a good move, just a good square for the knight. It's not hugely committal. And so now white has a number of choices, quite a few choices. I hope to cover some of these, but for this game, we're going to be looking at the most critical choice, probably the scariest looking move, which is queen to g4. And here, black has a few choices. White is currently attacking the pawn on g7, and black should probably not push this pawn, as it would introduce quite a few dark square weaknesses, and black has given up their dark square bishop. Like, pushing pawn looks very, very unpleasant. Like, it would greatly weaken the f6 square, the h6 square, all that kind of stuff. Black could castle kingside, like that has been played before. Like, it looks kind of like that might, drop an exchange to the bishop coming to h6, but black can play the move knight to f5, stuff like that, if black wants. But I like the move that is played in this game, which is the, kind of the second most popular move, but really the second most popular move and the third most popular move, they're kind of the same move in a way, since they often transpose. Like, the move that was played in this game is c takes d4. However, queen to c7 and c takes d4 often transpose. So the idea of c takes d4 is white takes here, black develops their rook to over here, like counterattacking, striking back. White takes here, and now black plays queen to c7 with some pressure and threats over here. And basically, c takes d4 and queen to c7, like, these moves, they often just transpose to each other. So even though they are the second and third most popular move, if you add them together, they are the most popular move. They are more popular than castling kingside, which is the #1 popular move instead of c takes d4. But I quite like this. This is very double-edged and very interesting. Like, basically, we're going all in on the imbalances. We're going all in on the game getting very interesting. So black is currently threatening to play queen takes c3 check, forking the king and the rook. And there isn't really a nice way of defending the pawn on c3. White does not have time to play c takes d4. And white probably should not be moving their queen again because, white's development is looking kind of bad, stuff like that. And also bishop to d2 and bishop to b2, those don't look so good since black could just take with the pawn with tempo. Oh, and actually it's even worse than that. I should show this real quick. Like, with bishop to d2, black can actually just take this pawn and then take this pawn. And with bishop to b2, it's kind of similar. Like, black can take this way first, or black can still take this pawn, like stuff like that. So white has to deal with the fact that not only is there queen takes c3 as a problem, but there's also queen takes e5. I should have included that arrow as well, since that's pretty nasty. So by far the most common move in this position is for white to play knight to e2, just defending these over here, and also stopping this check. Like queen takes 0 check. Like, if black plays queen takes 0 check, then white can just take like this, and maybe get the bishop out to f4 with some tempo on the queen, and white would be doing okay. Like, white's pawn structure on the queen side would be improved a fair bit. But this is not what happened in the game. In fact, that generally does not happen. So here, the most popular move by black by far is knight bc6, and I just quite like this move, just developing another piece, getting it into the game, and getting ready to take on e5. It looks like white might be able to take this pawn, but actually white cannot. For example, if white plays c takes d4, black can actually just sacrifice their knight like this, because this knight, it really should not be taking the knight on d4 now. Because if knight takes d4, and then we will have queen to c3 with check. And there's only really one good square for the king to go, as other squares would just lead to a loss of even more material. Like if king to d1, then queen takes d4 with check. And if king to e2, well, king to e2 is the only good square, or I should say. If bishop to d2, then queen takes a1 check would win the knight and rook that way. Hey, but this is not a good thing, not a good move for, like, not a good position for white to be getting in. White should not be giving up an exchange like this. So instead, in this position, by far the most popular move for white is pawn to f4, although bishop to f4 is also okay. It's also a playable move to defend this pawn on e5 with the bishop. But pawn to f4 is the move that was played in the game and is played most of the time. And now black generally just takes this pawn over here. And in this position, there are a number of choices for white. Right, and I think I've kind of gone enough into the theory, enough into the introductory theory. We are now 11 moves into the game. If you have made it this far, you are doing very, very well. Like if you understood all the moves that are played here and were able to follow along and you're able to remember it, then you're doing very, very well. And I think I will now introduce the players. So with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Jan Nepomniachtchi, who is a super grandmaster from Russia, and he is currently ranked number 3 in the world, and he has twice won the candidates tournament. He won the one in 2020 as well as the one this past year in 2022. And he has also won silver medals in the World Blitz Championship, the World Rapid Championship, as well as just this year, the World Fisher Random Championship. And he has also done very well in team events as well, including the World Team Chess Championship and the European Team Chess Championship. Like he has often helped bring those, like bring the Russian team to victory in both of those. He also has a course on Chessable about the King's Gambit, which I think is very interesting course, but also very sharp. Lots of theory there, lots of new ideas, but very cool stuff. And in terms of playing style, he is known for his dynamic play, although he can also play fairly solidly. Like basically all of the super grandmasters these days are universalists, but he is known for being able to win very complicated positions. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to his match with Ding Liren. And so with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Nikita Vitiugov, who is also a super grandmaster from Russia. He has a peak rating of 2750, and he's still above 2700 right now. Like, he still seems to be in good form. He won the Russian Chess Championship in 2021, and that's really saying something given, you know, how many strong Russian players there are, including, you know, the opponent of this game. And let's see, what else is there to say? Oh yes, I just remembered. He has written a number of books on the French defense. Like, they're a bit older, like they're from 10 years ago, but based off of how he played this game, I would say that he really, really knows what he's doing. And I'm unfortunately not too familiar with Grandmaster Vitiugov, but this game definitely made me a fan. And so, and also, this particular game, it was played at the Russian Championship Super Final in 2014, and more information about the players and the event can be found in the video description. So now back to the game. So in this position, black has just played d takes c3, kind of ensuring that black doesn't fall too far behind in terms of pawn count, ensuring that white cannot, be taking the pawn on d4, and also opening up the center a little bit. It's like the move pawn to f4. It did defend the e5 pawn, but it has kind of weakened, this diagonal a fair amount, which, whoopsies, I made the arrows disappear, which is, a bit scary for white, given that there's a rook on g8 staring over here. Black might go for some kind of kingside attack maybe in the future. So as a result, white generally is not going to be castling kingside, since white has this very nice h-pawn, this passed pawn, which can be good in the endgame. And one way for white to play this position is to push the pawn. Passed pawns are meant to be pushed. White wants to run this pawn down the board. So black wants to finish their development. Black, on the other hand, probably does want to castle, probably wants to get this rook into the game and get this king to a safer square. So black plays bishop to d7 with just a simple idea of developing and probably castling. Like black's probably not too afraid of losing this pawn, as it would help black's other rook get into the game with tempo and fight back over here. I think activity is just as important, if not more important, than pawns in this particular position, given how double-edged everything is. And what's crazy about the Winawer, what's crazy about this line in particular, is that even engines don't always understand it. Since in this position, white played queen to d3, which is a fine move just getting ready to get rid of this pawn on c3, stuff like that. And the engine considers it to be an inaccuracy, but if you let the engine sit for a bit, the engine actually kind of changes its mind after a while. It's like, actually, no, this move might be okay. And it's like, if the engine doesn't understand why it's inaccurate, then how am I going to understand? Sort of thing. I think this move is fine. If it's good enough for a super grandmaster, it's probably good enough for us. It's like queen d3 looks okay. And so black really likes this pawn on c3. It's just kind of a nice thorn in white's side. It's restricting white's dark square bishop here, making it harder for white to develop it. So black plays pawn to d4, and the engine again considers this to be an inaccuracy. It wants black to play knight to f5, but I think pawn to d4 is fine. I think this is totally fine. And in fact, I should probably, I should just turn on the engine and see if it changes its mind. Is it really plus 1.0? Let's see, does it change its mind? Only under a very, very specific line is it going to be plus 1.1. Interesting. It kind of changed its mind earlier. Although the very specific line, it's one that's fairly intuitive. Like, white should really be focusing on pushing the h-pawn in this position, as that is one of white's best assets. But I don't trust the engine. And white does, of course, play pawn to h5, which is the one move that helps preserve white's nice advantage according to the engine. Black castles queenside. And here, white now played rook to b1, which is, again, a move that I think is totally fine. Like, just developing the rook, activating it, probably getting ready to maybe strike at black on the queen side, stuff like that. Like, what's interesting is that both players, they haven't really fully developed all of their pieces yet. Like, their pieces, they're not all on good squares. Like, especially white's bishops over here. These want to get into the game. And so even though we're like 15 moves in, it's still kind of like we're in the opening in a way. Kind of. So black now plays king to b8, which is a very common move when you castle queenside, especially when the c-file is somewhat open like this. Like, it's not really open because there's still the pawn on c3, but the king is still kind of more vulnerable with the pawn pushed that far. And now here, white went for an interesting idea, which turns out to not actually really work so well. White's idea is to play pawn to g3 and try to get this bishop out this way. But black has a nice counter to that idea, which is to improve the positioning of their own bishop and to try to trade their light squared bishop for white's light squared bishop. Because remember, in the French, black's light squared bishop is very often a problem piece. So black will often be quite happy to trade it away. Not only that, but white has the bishop pair, which can be good in endgames, and one way to deal with an opponent's bishop pair is to just trade away one of the bishops. So black plays bishop to c8. The engine still doesn't like this. The engine really wants knight to f5, which I do think is a fine move. I think knight to f5 is a good choice as well. But I don't hate this bishop to c8 idea. In fact, I don't fully trust the engine in this video, just how complicated the Winawer gets. We have bishop to g2, pawn to b6, bishop to f3 with the idea of playing pawn to g4 to add some supports to the h-pawn. But the problem is that this plan is just a little bit slow. We have bishop to b7, pawn to g4, and now black plays knight to a5, getting ready to trade the bishops, trade away the bad light square bishop, also putting the knight on a somewhat better square potentially, since on c6 the knight, all it's currently doing is just defending this guy. It can't really do anything else. It can't get to e5, it can't get to b4, stuff like that. So we have rook to h3, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, and now knight to b7. Knight comes to b7 because it wants to jump to c5 and help push this pawn to d3. Like white's plan is to push this h-pawn down the board, and black needs to react to that. Black needs to either deal with that plan over here or strike back elsewhere, strike back at white's king, which is not castled and will never castle because white has moved both of their rooks. So, after knight to b7, white continues pushing their pawn. Black plays knight to c5. White plays pawn to h7. Engine doesn't like this. Pawn to h7 is very intuitive, though. It just kind of forces black's rook to be a bit passive, to get off of the more active g-file here and just sit on h8 staring at a pawn all day. So black plays rook to h8. It's the move that the engine wanted black to play white to play instead of pawn to h6 is rook to b5, and basically the engine is foreseeing that black's attack is going to be very strong here. So after rook to h8, white plays queen to g2. Black now plays queen to d7, and the engine considers this somewhat inaccurate, but I think this is fine. Black is just improving the position of their queen before they proceed with their attack. There isn't really anything that white can do to stop black's plan here. White now plays pawn to f5. I'm trying to continue with some kingside play, stuff like that, maybe open things up, maybe get access to the g8 square potentially, things like that. Just trying to do something, but black doesn't even have to pay attention to this pawn. Black just plays pawn to d3, and in this position, black has all sorts of nasty things going on. Unlike if white takes, black probably takes with the knight, with check, and continues the attack. The king is looking very uncomfortable where he is. Black is just blasting things open, and at the same time, white cannot really allow this pawn to come to d2 because that would be winning, at the very least, winning some material, maybe even queening the pawn, stuff like that. So white has to deal with this somehow. White probably doesn't want to take because that would just be opening things up way too much. And at the same time, I should actually just look at what would happen after taking. I think I know. I think after taking it's take, and then knight takes with check, and then if king goes to f1, because if king goes to d1, there's some nasty discoveries with like knight here with check, taking the queen due to discovered check. So after here, probably knight takes here. So king to f1, and now in this position, I would guess probably something like pawn to c2. That is my guess. Let's see if I am right. Yep, pawn to c2. Very nasty stuff. Pawn to c2, and then the engine is pretty scared. So rook a1, for example, just knight takes, getting out of the way so that the queen can come here. And then rook takes doesn't even help too much because the queen can still come here. Here, white's rook can't really take because black will queen, and it's black's c-pawn that's a monster, not white's h-pawn. White's h-pawn is under control. And basically, after a move like king f2, rook to d2 comes in, and white is not having a good time. White is very much not having a good time because there's ideas of rook takes knight followed by queen takes rook, stuff like that. So white is in a lot of trouble here. White is at the very least losing an exchange, but the engine sees even nastier things coming for white. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, in this position, white played knight takes c3, and now black played queen to d4, improving the position of their queen even further, hitting the knight, centralizing the queen, and getting it ready to potentially attack this king, maybe take the pawn over here, all this kind of nasty stuff. So white plays king to d2, defending the knight, but also putting the king in the line of fire of any potential discoveries here with pawn takes here, although the king could just take. So black, doesn't really want to do that. Black plays knight d5 because this knight over here is fairly annoying. White plays knight takes d5. Black plays knight to e4 check. This position is very scary for white. It's very nasty stuff upcoming. Like if king goes to e1, there's probably like pawn here with check, at the very least winning this bishop before black takes this knight over here, stuff like that. So as a result, we see king to d1 instead. And now queen takes d5 with some more nasty tactics on the way, with ideas of knight c3 with discovered check on the king, and then, a discovered attack on the queen and a check on the king. That's what I mean to say. And so there isn't any nice way of white to deal with all of this nastiness. Not only does it threaten to win the queen, but it also threatens to take this rook. So we have king to e1, now queen to a2. Ooh, and now in this position, white realizes that they cannot really save all their stuff, cannot really save this rook, because there's just too much pressure coming, too much stuff. White cannot really allow things like if the rook goes to b4, for example, black could probably play queen to a1, and there's no way to save this bishop, stuff like that, and basically be taking the bishop and then just pushing this pawn. So as a result, white decides to bail out with a desperado. Rook takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, now queen takes e4, queen to b1, still attacking this bishop. There isn't any nice way to really save this bishop, because going king to d1, black could just take on c2 with discovered check, double check, and the pawn being defended, stuff like that. And white cannot defend the bishop with queen to e3 because d2 check, and the bishop cannot take the pawn because it is pinned. So white has to allow black to take this bishop, but also has to basically deal with this pawn. White has to give up this bishop. So we have queen takes c1 check, and white is very, very dead here. Like, the engine says that white's next move is inaccurate, but honestly, it doesn't matter. There's no difference between losing and also losing. There is no difference. So basically, in this position, black is now up a rook, but white does have a tiny amount of compensation in the form of this pawn, but this compensation is nowhere near enough to, to draw this game, or to be enough. So black now plays rook to c8. We are now in a major piece endgame. We've got queen and rooks on the board and little else. And in major piece endgames, king safety is crucial. You want your king to be hiding in a bomb shelter somewhere until the pieces get traded off. You do not want to be activating your king. And, well, black's king over here, he's in a nice little bomb shelter. Like, it's very hard for white to actually get at this king. White does not really have time to, like, attack this pawn and then take it, because black's attack on white's king is too fast. So black's king is kind of defended by black's aggression. So black is basically going to be infiltrating with rook c2 check, stuff like that. There aren't really any good moves for white here. White played king to f3. Black still just brings the rook to c2 because it's very good here. And now for a little puzzle. If you want, you can pause the video and try to figure out what should black play if white were to just make some silly move like pawn to a4. I'm not going to make that move right now because it would kind of spoil the solution just a little bit. But if white were to play pawn to a4, like basically if white were to do nothing, if white were to play a silly move, what would black play? What is black's best move? Black's best way to continue? I will reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. So if white were to play pawn to a4, oh, good, the engine doesn't show it, that's good. Maybe I could have just put that move on the board, but it doesn't really matter. Black actually has mate in 2. We would have queen to f1 check. There is only one legal move for white. King to g3. And then we have checkmate. But this is not what happened in the game. Although it certainly could have happened in the game if it were a blitz game or something like that. White instead runs to g3, plays king to g3. Black still gives some checks. Queen to g1 check. King can't really run to h4 because then the rook will just take the pawn on h7 and probably just trade this rook away. As a result, we have king to f4. We have rook to f2 check. King to g5. Pawn takes f5 with the idea of just getting ready to take this pawn, going for like continuing the mating attack this way. White is essentially forced to trade queens, and that's very good for black because black is up a rook. Black will be very happy to go into an endgame, especially if black can get rid of this pawn as well. So in this position, white now plays rook to h1, counter-attacking black's queen, and black's like, yeah, okay, we can trade queens this way, it's no problem. And in this position, white now resigned, because after white takes black's queen, black will just take this pawn, and white will have no compensation for being down a rook. White will just be down a rook. Okay, and yeah, this was a very cool, very exciting game with a lot of stuff going on. I hope that you enjoyed it. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Bye for now.